4 verses 10 to 15. I'll give you a minute to find it. Starting at verse 10. When you make a loan of any kind to your neighbour, do not go into their house to get what is offered to you as a pledge. Stay outside and let the neighbour to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. If the neighbour is poor, do not go to sleep with their pledge in your possession. Return their cloak by sunset, so that your neighbour may sleep in it. Then they will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act in the sight of the Lord your God. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin.
Hi everyone, I'm Tara, and I will be reading our New Testament reading, which is coming from James chapter 4, verses 13 to chapter 5, verse 11. Give you a moment to find that. James chapter 4. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why do you not even know what will happen tomorrow? What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone, then, knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. The corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in your last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord is coming near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance. You have seen the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy.
Thank you, Tara and Chloe, for reading for us. Great reading. And Ben, I want to say thank you for praying, but I don't know if people understand how much of a dangerous prayer you just prayed as we come to today's passage. Did that cross your mind that Ben was praying something that is going to hurt our hearts if we're obedient to this passage? I kind of want to give you a warning as we come to it today that James has some challenges for us, and if our hearts are open, there'll probably need to be change. And so I encourage you to come with an open heart as I ask you, what motivates you? What gets you out of bed? What is it that keeps you going day by day and into the long term? What drives you? There's a secular motivational coach who kind of pops up on TikTok and places like that, who has this question. He just asks, what motivates you? And he gives 3 options. He says, is it sex, money, or power? What motivates you? Sex, money, or power? Now, we live in Sydney and he doesn't, so I want to add in a 4th option. He says you've got to pick one. Here's my 4 and you get to pick 2. Sex, money, power or housing? Pick two. And if you find Jensen's challenge just a little bit crass, sex, money, power, let me tart it up a bit for you if you want it a little bit more poetic. Romance, finance, potence, residence, preference? I'm saying the same thing. I just try to make it sound nicer. Sex, money, power, housing. What do you live for? What motivates you? What do you get out of bed for? Is it one of those things? If you had to pick one, is it on the list? In James today, he gets right in under the skin. Under the skin, pokes at the heart's desires and asks us, what are we living for? And he does it in two strong warnings. You notice as we read it there, two now listens. So in 4:13 and 5:1, now listen. And those will be the really challenging bits, but he finishes with some encouragement, particularly if you feel like you're on the victim end of the now listens rather than the kind of perpetrating end of the now listens. So with all that in mind, get ready for James to poke as we come to 4:13. Here is warning here. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow, we'll go to this city or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and we'll make money. James's problem here is not travel or business or making money per se. It's doing these things without consideration of God. It's not concerned with God's purposes. And so this problem is actually the problem. It's the most fundamental problem. It's the very first sin that James is warning us against, and that is asserting my authority over God's authority. I know better than God. I'm independent of God. It's Adam and Eve's sin. It's all of our sins. But it's a ridiculous sin. And he points that out very clearly. Verse 14, you don't even know what will happen to you tomorrow. Now you may think you know what will happen tomorrow, but God is sovereign. He's omnipotent, he's omniscient, he's omnipresent, he knows everything, he is able to be everywhere, he is all-powerful, he is not limited, he doesn't have to pick one, he is all of those things. We don't know if we're going to be sick tomorrow. Caleb didn't know that he couldn't turn up and get his special socks from King's Chicken. How good was that? He didn't know that was going to happen, and now he's got to drive to Wee Waa tomorrow without getting to say goodbye. We don't know if the trains will run next week. We literally don't know. Who knows what's going to happen with this strike? We don't know if we'll lose our job in the new year and they say, thanks for coming, you don't have a job next year. We don't know much. Now, we might say, haha, but I know gravity. And I know the sun will rise in the east tomorrow. But do we actually know that? Only Jesus knows that. If he returns, gravity, the sun rising, that's up to him what will happen next. James's point is very clear. We aren't in control. Indeed, verse 14, we are a mist that appears for a little while and just vanishes. A lovely Campbelltown spring morning, a mist in the air, the sun comes out, boom, it's gone. We're here today and we're gone tomorrow. My nana, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, used to say to me, JC, now you can't say JC to me, but that was her word, JC. When she was 50, at her 50th birthday party, she said, life goes quickly. In a blink of an eye, you're 50. And I arrogantly thought as a 10-year-old, what do you know? And I turned 50 last week. It's true, she was right. Like a mist. Another 50 years, if I was to get that long, will be gone. The fool acts arrogantly. The fool thinks they know better than God. Verse 16, they boast in their arrogant schemes. That's what the fool does. But boasting is evil. Because boasting without God is thinking you know better than God. What an evil thing to do. Instead, verse 15, the wise says, if it's the Lord's will, I will live and do this or that. And that's not meant to be a tack on to whatever you say. What James is saying is the literal definition of sin, the OG definition of sin, to think we know better than God, to make plans independent of him, is evil and wrong, which makes this passage a big deal for us. Because if anyone knows what is good and what we should do, it should be us Christians. Verse 17, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. You know we Christians have been given God's good word. We know from 2 Timothy 3:16 we have everything to live righteous lives. We know from Ephesians 2 verse 10 that God made us to do good works. And so verse 17 for us says it's sinful arrogance if we know what is good, then we don't do it. Just think about that. Does it stab in your heart? Maybe it's just me. How many times have I made plans, laid out plans, thought I'll do this and then that, without consideration of God? How many times have I, and maybe you too, tacked on whatever you want to the end of your plans? I'm going to do this. If it's the Lord's will, you're just baptizing your plan. You're just saying, I'm going to do it anyway, but if it's the Lord's will. How often do we make plans when we really just mean, I'm going to do it, and I'm not thinking about God? James is challenging us. When we plan, the big things of life, those things that I listed off, sex, money, power, housing, all the things, we shouldn't leave God out of the plan. We can't have accidental sort of forgetting, because it is a sin of omission. It's not giving God his place. It's not living out the faith that James 1:22 says we're called to do. It's like living as a non-believer if we don't keep God in our plans. James gets under my skin. Gets under my skin. This hurts. Because we live in a world that teaches us to be independent and self-motivated and up we go and let's do these things. But without God, it is evil. Especially in self-centered, consumerist Sydney. That's where we live, right? We live in a city where capitalism is the air we breathe. In fact, we have to breathe that air to make it all work. We need to consume. Secularism has been forcing us to forget God. Consume, but don't think about God. It's the direct opposite of what James wants. The world wants us to live for us. Because sex, money, power, housing, retirement, you don't have to choose one. Choose them all. They are all yours. The world is your oyster. And even if you can't have them now, you've seen the superannuation ads, haven't you? For the last 30 years, since super became compulsory, back in 92, the same ad's been playing. Different companies, different faces. It's the same ad. These old people walk down the beach hand in hand, looking at the water. They're completely content. Life is good. Everything's perfect. They're going to live forever. And it's a lie. An evil lie. Brothers and sisters, as Christians, God and his plans must be a part of what we plan and do. And God is no killjoy. He's not anti-holidays. He invented rest. He's not anti-sex. He invented marriage. He's not anti-money. He's made many faithful people stewards of his resources over the years and in his word. And he's not even anti you having your own place to lay your head. Foxes have dens, birds have nests. Just the Son of God didn't have a home in this world. All these things are under God's sovereignty. Why would we leave him out? And so let me come to that little list that fellow Jensen gave us. And the question is, what plans will we make when it comes to sex, to romance? Will we be like the world? Because there is a well-trodden path. Sex and romance, isn't that about my happiness, my gratification? Shouldn't I pursue what is best for me? That's what the world says to us. Or will we seek God's will, trusting his plans for sex only within marriage? And marriage only if it is right for you and in your circumstances, because singleness with godly contentment is good before God. where we realize that the world's ideals, its gendered and sexual identity standards, they're not ours. They're not God's. We don't pursue those things. We're not defined by them. When it comes to sex, romance, what place does God have in our plans? When it comes to choosing a spouse, would we take anyone who'll love us? Or will we choose somebody who knows the Lord, that will be with us on the same page? You can see how making plans without God could lead to difficult circumstances down the track. What about money? There was sex, now money. There's a fair bit on money in this passage, so I'll leave some for later on. But it is worth noticing here, money is probably the biggest evil for Christians to face. The Apostle Paul labels greed as idolatry, and here we are in consumerist Sydney. We can't serve two masters. We can't serve money and Jesus. We'll serve one and hate the other, says Jesus. But how many Christians get caught up in the pursuit of money, in the pursuit of ignoring God's will for our money? What about power? We'll come back to money in a moment. So many chase powerful careers or roles that give them opportunity to show who they are, to lead in big teams or to do something impressive, chasing an identity in this world. Do you know someone in this world whose whole identity is what they do? And we buy into that when we go to parties and we meet strangers and we say, "Oh, what do you do?" as the very first question that we ask people. God doesn't care about what we do. He cares about how we do it. He's not kind of going, "Oh, you've got a better job than that person, so higher place in heaven." Not at all. The slave in the New Testament was supposed to work faithfully, which meant when the master wasn't looking, do your job faithfully. But the master was supposed to love like Jesus and respect the slave and treat them as a brother, even though the slave had a role to play in the home. Whatever we do, we're supposed to honour God. And so, as you plan your work, what will you do and what does God have to say about it? There's lots we could talk about on that front today. But I do want to say that there are so many Christians who have slowly choked their faith to death by not being able to participate in the life of Christ's church, by being so busy they can't be here on a Sunday night, by being so busy that actually can't have time for any other Christian. Well done. That's not you, clearly. But it is a danger if we let careerism drive who we are. Factor Jesus into your career plans. I reckon it'd be better to pull a handle in a factory for 50 years and be free to serve and attend church and be involved in the life of God's people than it will be to face Jesus and say, "Yeah, I worked 100 hours a week. I was really important. I got paid lots of money, but I never involved myself in the life of your church." I know which I'd rather, a sore arm all the way. What about buying homes and owning homes? What does God have to say? Well, it's not all that specific on home ownership. As I said, it's not bad to own a place, to have somewhere to lay your head. But what does the world do? Well, the world chases the biggest and the best, and usually straight off, right? You'll have friends who say, "Well, what's my borrowing capacity?" "Okay, it's 1.5 million. Great, I'll spend 1.5 million. And then they end up in slavery to the loan for the rest of their lives. We need to stop and think, what place does God have in buying a home? And surely he has much to say. Firstly, don't sell your soul to a financial institution. I worked for a bank, they couldn't care less about you. Just pay that interest. And so, stop and think. For some, it is better to rent than buy. Not in worldly wisdom. I just said an evil in worldly wisdom. But for some, it is better to rent than buy because of the way they're made, or because of the way they think about ownership of things, or because it will be a burden they cannot really fulfill without giving up on their faith. And I know people who have made that choice. They still meet Jesus in heaven. There are other people who will say, well, I could borrow 1.5 million, but I'm not gonna. I'm gonna borrow 900,000 and get that 2-bedroom unit, just 900,000. That's the problem, isn't it? I've got some friends who did that with 3 boys and raised them in this little tiny unit, just so they could keep serving in their church. Wow, that's a commitment. Sydney is a place that makes home ownership number one. But what place does God have in our housing plans? And I don't just say that as you're entering in to buy, I also say that to those who own. Well, what place does God have in your home ownership and in the resources that he has given you? If we hear James here, it's uncomfortable because sex, money, power, home ownership, all these things need to have God in them. Let us not ignore the problem of evil that comes if we exclude him from what we're doing. It is sin. That's his first warning. I don't know if you can take much more. You can take some more? Well, you don't get a choice because we're going to have a look at 5 verse 1. Now listen, he says, he comes again. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming to you. James turns now to a specific situation in time, but it can kind of be any situation in time. It happens all the time, what he's about to say. If you remember, he's writing to Jewish Christians, likely poor, scattered out of Jerusalem, and they've found themselves in places where fellow countrymen are settled and rich and have their places, and they're running the farms, and they're running the industry, and they're employing people, and they're living with them. Some of these people are probably Christians. Some are Jews who are hanging out with the Christians and meeting in the synagogues. But James is clear, all of them should know better than what is happening. Whether Old Testament following Jews or converted Christians, verse 2, your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. This is not an all-out attack on money. It's an all-out attack on using money evilly. If we use our money for self-seeking purposes, for storing up and accumulating for ourselves, like happens here, it seems they have so much abundance they can afford to have clothes lying around. They're not wearing them, they're not using them, they're getting moth-eaten, they're rotting. They've just got so much. Or the gold and the silver, it's corroded. Pure gold and pure silver don't corrode. But if you put them together, they tarnish one another. If you pile up your money, they're tarnishing one another. If you have so much that's lying around, not in use, not in your pocket, not getting shined all the time, sitting around like this, then you're being self-indulgent, says James. Verse 4, it's worse. The rich aren't paying their workers properly. And so he doesn't hold back in verse 5. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You've fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. What an image that they are consuming and so self-indulgent that they're making themselves this fat sacrifice for the judgment day. James is angry. Verse 6 brings that home. He says, it's like you've committed murder. Against innocent people who deserve their wages, you've committed murder. I don't think he means they're rushing out in the field and stabbing them and killing them. I think he means institutionalised murder. In other words, they've got the money, they control the courts, they control what they pay people, there's no Fair Work Commission, and so effectively, if they steal their money back from the people they're supposed to pay, those people are going to starve and they're going to die. What an evil. And James just calls it out in verse 1. This misery will come upon the exploitive rich people when they face judgment. They'll get theirs. And we say, Amen. Except, you knew there was an except. Except, in the world's standards, we're the rich. We are the rich. Whatever you are earning, we are the rich. If you have access to safe water, you're better off than 2.2 billion people in the world. Wow. If you have more than 3 Aussie dollars a day to spend, you are ahead of 50% of the world's population, living on less than $1.50 US a day. If you bought a cup of coffee today, you've just shown your wealth. Here in Australia, if your personal income is over $40,000 a year, you're well over the top half of Aussies, according to the last census. See, we are the rich. I said, it's okay to be rich. Wealth is not the problem in and of itself. It's what we do with it. Providing we use our wealth to bless and not for self-indulgence, praise God. But if it's for self-indulgence, we need to listen up in James chapter 5. My experience in pastoral ministry over the years has been that most people would prefer to talk about their sex life than about how they use their money. And that's saying something. Because if I sat you down and said to you, so how's your sex life? You would cringe and go, please don't ask about that. I don't do that, okay? Don't worry. If I want to meet up with you, that's not why I'm trying to meet up with you. But when it's necessary to talk about these things, this is the truth. People talk more freely about their sex life than about what they do with money. And that's because the world has its claws in us. We're like the world. Greed is idolatry, and we kind of follow along what's happening around, subtly worshipping wealth by joining in with the ideas of the world. You know the ideas of the world. We've got to get our ducks in a line. Here are the ducks you've got to get in a line. You've got to get your savings, your investments, your insurance policies, your superannuation. That's compulsory now, so you've got that done for you. Bank buffers, lifestyle, kids' schooling, extracurricular activities for you and the kids. Get them all lined up, and then once you do, think about what to give to God or to others. Isn't that the wisdom of the world? Line up the ducks. Some years ago, a mid-40s guy in a church we're in became a Christian. I had the privilege of leading him to Christ, and for months after, we were working through lots of things. And I remember the day he came to me and he said, look, I've been thinking about money. I've heard what you've said, and I just want to say, I'm making a commitment to you today. I can't give money. I don't have any extra money. I can't give any money to church or to mission or anything like that. But when I win the lotto, I'm committing to giving 50% of the lotto to church. Okay, there's so many things I want to say to you at this moment. But I said to him, that's interesting. How much do you spend on the lotto? He's like, somewhere between 10 and 50 bucks a week. It depends which ones I'm playing and whether there's jackpots. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, mate, but okay. Have you ever won? Not a cent. Never won anything. Okay, why do you think you're going to win? Well, if you play long enough, you'll win. So how about this? How about instead of playing lotto, we take that $10 to $50 a week, which is, what is that, $520 through to a couple of $1,000. Why don't we take that and instead, why don't you think about how you can bless people with that? Stop playing lotto. He took a while to think about it, but in the end he did after a few weeks. But he's a good illustration of the kind of partitioning I think we're all tempted to make. Maybe you don't play the lotto, but it's so easy to think of all the things that are cordoned off from God that don't belong to God before we get to the bits that maybe God can have a bit of. That's the self-indulgence that's being talked about. Playing the lotto is a kind of self-indulgence. It's many other things, but it's a self-indulgence. God doesn't give us money so that we can give him the worst or the none. No, he wants the first fruits. He wants generosity out of his people as a quality of us. To put on the number one expenditure line each year, giving. It doesn't have to be the most high thing, it's just the number one priority for our life as Christians. To give to the work of God, to his kingdom. He wants us to consider him first as we plan financially, and then line the ducks up behind that and make the decisions we have to make. Now, don't mishear me here. James is not saying sell everything and give it to the poor. Not at all. Even in the Old Testament, the tithe was 10%. Or if you really read all the laws, you could probably add it up to 20, 30% if you followed every law to the letter. Somewhere 10 to 30%. That's not everything. God wanted his people to enjoy the goodness of what they made and have. But he did say, be generous as well. In the New Testament, 10% is still a good guide, though we're not under the law, which means that we don't need to give 10%. But generosity would suggest we should try and work out how much we can give, not limit it to a legalistic, what is the little bit that I can. So James isn't saying sell everything. And certainly we are to wisely fulfill our obligations. In the New Testament, if you have a family or a household, you are responsible for them. You're not to be a burden. If you cannot be a burden, don't be a burden, so that those who truly need help can get the help they need. But this means wise financial management individually and a willingness to hear the challenge. Not to fatten ourselves for the day of slaughter, not to live with luxurious self-indulgence at the expense of others, but to let James under our skin, to hear what he's saying, to feel the challenge, not in guilt, but so that we use what God gives us for his glory. I said it would poke us. Doesn't get more pokey than money. Which is why then when we come to verse 7, it's like a balm. It's an ointment that is going to be applied as we come to read from verse 7, particularly if you are someone who feels like you're on the wrong end of the deal when it comes to money. You actually don't have much to put to your name, or if you're someone who feels persecution or sickness or whatever it is. Verse 7, be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient. Stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. See, James names the reality. The Lord's coming is near. He could come back tonight. And what have we done with what we have? Verse 9, he's the judge standing at the door to judge mankind. This is the reality of existence. It's not sex, money, power, buying homes. That's not the reality. Those are consequential decisions of having to live in the world. This is the reality. And this reality is supposed to trump all the pains, all the discomforts, all the challenges. At least it should. And that's why we have to be willing to hear James when he says, now listen. And again, now listen. So that now we hear this command as well in verse 8, be patient and stand firm. Don't think Jesus is taking too long to come back. I can't be bothered. He hasn't come back in 2,000 years. He's obviously not coming. Don't throw out your faith or your hope. Don't get caught up in grumbling about your lot, particularly grumbling about the lot of others compared with your lot, as seems to be on James's mind in verse 9. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. Rather be patient, says verse 10. Patient like Job. If you know the story of Job, Satan accused Job that he was a fair weather believer. In other words, when all is well, when your life is good, you trust God. Let's take all that goodness away and let's see if you trust God. God allows Satan to do that, and Job refuses to curse God and die. He's not a knight in shining armour. He didn't do everything perfect, but he didn't curse God and die because he knew, verse 11, that the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. So let me ask you, do you believe that? Is the Lord who is coming soon full of compassion and mercy for you? Do you believe it enough not to grumble against others and your lot versus their lot? Do you believe it enough to include God in every plan of life and all the big decisions? Do you believe it enough to express it in what you do with your money and your wealth and your time and your priorities? And James is telling us that believing these things, living these things is what it is to patiently stand firm. And so the motivation is Jesus' return and his coming mercy for his people. In the world, it's sex, romance, money, finance, power, potence, homes, residence. Pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But not for us. For us, stand firm, wait patiently, trust God is full of compassion and mercy for you. I'm going to finish with another dangerous prayer. But I'm going to start by apologising to God for my unfaithfulness, and you might like to join me in that. Let's bring this to God. Heavenly Father, we admit that there are so many ways where we haven't actually listened to what James is saying here. There have been many times where we've made our own plans, big plans for life, for work, for relationships, for travel, all of these things, but not thinking about you and your purposes in this world. Father, please forgive us. We thank you that you're not stingy to us. We thank you that you've given us rest and money and health and all these things for our good. May we use what you've given us for your glory and as a response to your goodness to us. And so, Father, we pray as we hear these challenges to listen, that we would be listeners. Please hear each of our independent individual responses and grow us to know and love you more and serve you better for Jesus' sake. Amen.